All right, hello and welcome to round two of the Cherry Blossom Open. So we saw in the first round we did get the win going into this round, so reasonably happy obviously with the score. It can't be any better, but the quality of the game to get there was really not that good. I was very not just disappointed with my play, but also had a little bit of lack of confidence going into this round and the rest of the tournament, especially around my calculation ability and kind of my judgments in the opening. I sort of did what I set out to do going into the first round, where I played a very, very dubious variation of what's already a dubious opening in the hopes of just kind of getting some kind of unfamiliar position for my opponent. But I really wasn't feeling comfortable in them, or certainly not as comfortable as I used to. I was very, very scared of really everything. I was taking a lot of time in the opening, even though it was this sort of position that I had prepared for myself. And so was a little bit I was a little bit concerned going into the rest of the event, especially in my opening selection of okay, well, I'm kind of between a rock and a hard place now. I can play my normal openings, which are very solid, and I'm very comfortable in them, but they don't give me a lot of winning chances against an opponent who's very, very happy to just kind of make a draw. Or I can play these very, very risky openings that are objectively quite bad, but give me some chances to outplay a weaker opponent. But if I'm not feeling comfortable in them, then uh, it's kind of defeats the purpose entirely. The whole point is to get a position where at least my plan is obvious and they have to find the right path to an advantage. So going into the second round, I figured with the white pieces, the calculation is a little bit different. Like with black, obviously you have to take quite a lot of risk to get a game, but with white, the onus is always on you to win, regardless of the strength of your opponent. So it's kind of fine to just play the main lines. All of the main lines are centered around winning the game anyway. It's not like with the black pieces, it's a little weird because all of the main lines in this theory is centered around equalizing comfortably. And so you have to deviate from theory to get a game. But with the white pieces, you can just kind of play theory because theory is intended to get an advantage. And so that's sort of what I decided to do in this game. Partially as like a bit of stubbornness also. There's some kind of uh, just ego thing of, okay, I'm playing a 2100 rated player. He's a good player. I've played him before. But he's a 2100 rated player. I should on paper be much better. Am I really going to let like a 2100 player like force me off of my main openings? Like that seems like an admission of a problem, right? And I don't like admitting that I have problems. So instead, we decided to stubbornly press on with my main stuff. The first, I guess the main choice here, of course, is whether to go bishop c4 or bishop b5. I've been struggling with the Italian recently, as we've seen in the last couple of tournaments. There's been a few videos on Italian games where I really haven't been understanding the positions particularly well, particularly the positions where we eventually make a big center with d4 and c4 and they respond with d6 and c5. I've had a lot of difficulty proving an advantage in that style of position. We'll see this later in the tournament as well. So I decided to revert back to the Ruy Lopez, which is something that I've played a lot when I was younger, not a lot super recently. So this was kind of my compromise. Let's go with something that's still a main line, but not one of my like super solid standard things. The Ruy is obviously a lot more aggressive. My opponent played knight f6, which I wasn't really expecting. I did do a bit of cursory preparation for this game, and I saw that he has had like several blitz games in Title Tuesday and whatever with the Berlin, but he also has had some games in the Breyer variation of the Ruy Lopez with like starting with a6 and going into this main step with bishop e7, eventually playing it back to b8 to get out of the way of c5. But my opponent told me after the game that, he plays the Breyer for a win and he plays the Berlin for not a win, so I probably should have expected that. The Berlin, of course, extremely solid, one of the biggest headaches for the white player in the last couple of decades of trying to prove any kind of advantage against this opening whatsoever. Castles, d4, really everything has kind of led nowhere. One of the modern things to do is to play d3, which is what I played, and then after bishop c5 to take on c6. But I don't love those types of positions. I mean, they're obviously like nothing wrong with them. Certainly completely playable. But I decided that that sort of position is if I'm not super comfortable in it against an opponent that does play the Berlin, it's probably best to play not quite the main line against such a player, especially one that's a little bit double-edged, and you get these positions that can often look like a Rosselimo Sicilian, which I've had very, very poor results in. Clearly had a lot of difficulty understanding the positions, and especially it's a position where you end up getting attacked as white a lot of the time, and you have to defend and sort of wait for black to overextend. But after bishop c5, I decided to play the much more stable move c3, which starts to look very, very similar to the Italian. Of course, this would be the mainline Italian if the bishop was back on c4. So a very, very similar type of position to the thing that I'm familiar with playing. And I did have a little bit of preparation here, not for my opponent specifically, but just in general, on the off chance that my opponent ever plays a Berlin, because it's not actually that popular these days. This is at least a line that I could try. My opponent went castle, castle, d6. This is all still the main line. h3, knight e7. This is one of the things that black can try. The knight goes to e7 partially to go to g6, which is also like a very Italian idea. White is going to be doing the same thing. Rook e1, knight d2, knight f1, knight g3 is a very typical idea. But this also gets the knight out of the way of the pawns, so black can play c6 and then d5 and start to contest the center. The main idea for white is that, since the bishop is on b5 and black's bishop is on c5, we kind of get d4 with tempo, which means that we're kind of first to the center. And that's going to be the only advantage that white has, but it should be an advantage. It's not going to be a lot, but it should be something. So we take advantage of this immediately by playing d4. Our opponent's forced to move back to b6. And then, black is eventually going to play c6 and d5. This is kind of forced. And also we do need to defend this pawn on e4. So a nice multi-purpose way to deal with this is just to slide the bishop back to d3. I think we're still kind of well within theory here. My opponent played knight g6, rook e1, so far still within my preparation, c6, knight b d2, and now black has a few options. I think I was most familiar with rook e8 here, which is a very logical move, just getting the rook to the e-file. This also helps prepare d5. And then there are a number of things that white can try here. One of the main lines that has seen play, for example, has seen play at the top level, is just continuing the plan with knight f1, allowing d5, and then the point is that white will play the move bishop g5, taking advantage of the fact that h6 hasn't been played, and after takes, actually take with the rook, which looks a little bit strange, but with this pin, white has very, very good chances of picking up this pawn on e5, which is only a slight advantage, because that pawn will then, in turn, be very unstable, and black will usually manage to organize pieces around it and collect it back. But it is all position. White can try to hold the pawn, and if black is not careful, he can just be kind of down a pawn. Another option, which is, really there's a lot of options. I mean, a lot of moves make sense. Like white can play a4, for example, to try to gain some space on the queen side. White can play like knight c4, I think is also possible, hitting the bishop and intending to go to e3 through a different route, e3 and then f5. So white has a very wide array of choices here. And rook e8 is very automatic. I think this is the only move that I was familiar with. But my opponent spent a bit of time here, which I thought was a good sign, because I assumed that meant he was a little bit unfamiliar with the position. But he instead decided to play the move e takes d4, which I thought looked very, very bizarre, visually speaking. Seemed like, black is just kind of giving away the center for not a whole lot. So I wasn't really sure what his idea was. I went ahead and took back on d4, because I kind of had to. d5 was played, and then, white pretty much has to play e5, so there's nothing to talk about. I kind of I was wondering if my opponent was intending to just sacrifice a pawn with knight e4 here. The idea being takes, bishop e6, just kind of putting a bishop on d5 and trying to argue that, the position is solid enough even down a pawn with getting a piece to d5 and this structure being a little bit loose, but I didn't really believe it. It seems, still seems very, very strange. White is basically just up a pawn for not a whole lot. And also white is very quick with a plan of like knight g5, f4, f5, and so on, just trying to play on the king side with the additional space that this brings. But my opponent played knight h5, and I still didn't really get it, to be honest. But I started spending quite a lot of time here because I really wasn't sure how to contest this idea. Black is very quickly going to play f6 to try to break down this structure, and if white is forced to take, then black gets very, very strong control of the f-file. This is presumably the reason that black decides to keep the rook on f8. Just sort of keep pressure on the f-file instead of having to put the rook on e8, and then this idea of f6 is a little bit less powerful. So I started to realize at this point that I was probably facing computer prep. The whole idea obviously makes no sense from black's play doesn't really make sense from a human perspective. Giving away the whole center for basically nothing is odd. Probably not something you're going to come up with over the board very easily. This is really the sort of thing that you're only going to appreciate the strength of if you've already played around a lot with the engine in such a position. So I really wasn't sure how to continue here. I definitely realized that my opponent probably knew exactly what was going on, and so I started trying to metagame it a little bit. If my opponent, well, presumably this position's equal because my opponent played it, so my opponent knows that this is equal, or at least not more than like very, very, very slightly worse for black. Like maybe it's like plus 0.2, plus 0.3, whatever. But nothing substantial. So then the question is why? Because white visually should be a lot better. White should have an overwhelming position. Like it should be, plus 0.6, plus 0.7, maybe even as high as plus 1. So, then I started to look at like I sort of took this train of thought to its like very logical extreme. I'm like, okay, what sort of moves like lead to 0.2? Like what would even be a 0.2 move in this position? So I started thinking a lot about taking on g6, which again, from a human perspective, very, very weird move. We're giving away a bishop, also our good bishop, because our pawns are dark squares. So the light square bishop you would think is a very, very good piece for white, and in fact it's probably white's best piece in the position, at least visually speaking, because this is an honor bishop. In addition to being just a bad bishop because of dark squares, it's actually looking at nothing right now. Both of the knights are kind of also staring into a wall right now, so we're giving away like our only good piece, which seems a little weird. But on the other hand, we are interfering a little bit with black's idea of playing f6, and we're going to say that we're relying entirely on the space advantage that's earned by the pawns on d4 and e5. So I did spend a lot of time thinking about this. Black probably can't take with this pawn because after knight b3, this knight is kind of trapped. So black would basically be forced to take with the f pawn, and then white can argue that the compromised pawn structure is a little bit of an advantage, maybe enough of an advantage even for white to be better. But I thought it was really, really unlikely that white can be substantially better here. Black is going to put the bishop on f5 at some point, and knight is coming to f4. Some piece is going to just sort of blockade on e6, and so even though white is like kind of sort of up a pawn in like the relevant parts of the position, or like has very good control over the center, without the light square bishop, I thought it would be very, very difficult to actually win this position. So then I started thinking about moves like, okay, what if I just like ignore this entirely and allow the knight to come to f4 and allow black to play f6? Like, is it really that big a deal? And I think I kind of underestimated it, but eventually I decided like, okay, if I want to win the game, I have to allow such a thing. So I played knight b3. I wasn't sure about knight b3 versus knight f1, but as we'll see, I wanted to keep this square available. The knight is also kind of like wants to head to c5 sometimes, so I thought this wouldn't be that bad a square for the knight. overall, I thought it was just like a move. My opponent played knight f4, and then, I started to realize here that I had kind of underestimated the attack a little bit, because I thought that after bishop c2, which is very natural, just keeping the bishop on the long diagonal, f6, takes, and then like, let's say knight c5. I thought that black didn't really have any real way to improve the attack. Or, well, okay, I guess not knight c5. What was I thinking? I was thinking rook e3, I guess, to defend against knight takes h3 and keep this knight under key. So I didn't think that black had any real way to continue this attack. And in the meantime, I'm just going to play like knight c5, maybe knight e5, probably king h2 to shore up the defense a little bit, develop the rest of the pieces, and then our kind of control over these squares should be pretty important, and like maybe a route to an advantage. But I had mostly missed this move knight h4, which I realized after knight f4 was played that this was probably my opponent's idea, and then suddenly this attack looks really, really actually quite powerful, because if we do take, then takes on h4. Now black is really threatening to sacrifice on h3 to blow open white's king position, and white really has no way to bring any pieces into the attack. Everything is diverted to the queen side and has no real route back into the game. So I started to get pretty concerned about the attack here and decided, I mean, even here I probably should take on g6, honestly, just to try to blunt the strength of the attack a little bit. But I played this move bishop f1, kind of thinking that, okay, I'll get to play king h2, I'll get to play g3, kick away this knight, and we should be okay. My opponent, of course, played f6. I played bishop e3. Again, my idea was, okay, I'm going to hold the pawn on e5. I'm going to play king h2, g3 next, force this knight away. Then I'll move the knight, play f4, and things will look, back to reasonable. And if my opponent does take, then, we've also offered up the exchange of dark square bishops, which is very, very favorable for me. If we can get off my bad bishop for his his good bishop, then we're obviously going to be very, very happy. And even if he doesn't allow that, then the knight bishop can come to like c5 or something, and suddenly this bishop starts to look pretty active. So at this point, this was the best that I could come up with. If we go back from knight h5, like this was, I kind of foresaw this position, and I thought, okay, we at least have ideas. King h2, g3, etc. is a plan. And if we get the time to execute it, it really is a quite powerful plan. But here my opponent found this very nice move bishop c7, and I realized that I actually just don't have time for that anymore. This pawn on e5 is under serious pressure now. We can't really defend it. It is just going to end up being taken if we don't take on f6 ourselves. And if we do take on f6, then it's kind of a disaster, because after takes, like, queen takes f6, now king h2 obviously is not possible anymore, so we're never going to get g3 in. What black is immediately threatening to take on h3, and we have a lot of trouble defending this knight. And if we try to, like, go back to f2, d2 or something, like, we just don't have enough pieces on the king side to start contesting what is now a very, very serious attack. Every one of black's pieces is kind of very harmoniously attacking my king, and in the meantime, mine are, like, just kind of off in the distance doing whatever. So I realized at this point I was probably more than a little bit worse, maybe even substantially worse. And we kind of had to, we kind of have to hit the emergency panic button. So after a lot of thought, I invested like a lot of time here. After a lot of thought, I realized that, okay, first of all, my position is worse, but also we're down nearly half an hour on the clock. There's a very, very real chance that we kind of lose this game without any fight. Let's try to look for safety here. And so I took an f4 and offered a draw, which fortunately ended up being accepted, which I was frankly very surprised at, because I thought that I was in very, very deep trouble here. If we continue the line, black obviously is going to take back. Now, white is still facing problems with this pawn on e5. We probably still have to take. After takes, obviously, once again, black is still threatening to take on h3 and then take on f3, so rook e3 is kind of forced. We probably have to, like, spend time bringing this knight back, but I thought that this was a very risk-free position for black. there really is no advantage for white in this position at all. We're just kind of defending. And so I was particularly concerned about bishop f5 coming to e4 when I think that white is in very, very big trouble, because then we're going to have a lot of trouble dealing with stuff like knight h3. Also, you know, black is also perfectly capable of playing stuff like queen g6 and putting pressure on h3, forcing king h1, and then, you know, keeping up the pressure with moves like bishop f5, bishop e4 is maybe a useful inclusion to get these moves in as well. So I was very surprised that my opponent accepted the draw, because I thought that it was basically impossible for black to ever be in trouble here. But I was very happy that he did, because we were facing the prospect of a very, very unpleasant defense. So yeah, I mean, obviously a disappointing result. You know, chess is a draw, of course, but giving away a draw with the white pieces playing substantially down and from a position of weakness in just, you know, 17 moves is obviously a very large disaster. It speaks to my inexperience in these types of Ruy Lopez positions. I don't play the Ruy Lopez a lot recently, so I'm certainly not up to date in theory, but this isn't really even a theory loss, I would say. You know, obviously we were familiar with this computer idea, and we reacted very, very poorly, but this is also not like a big computer idea. You know, it's not like white needs to be like, it's not the sort of thing where you would expect white to need to like find some like crazy sequence of like 12 only moves to keep an advantage or something. Like, this is the type of position you should just be able to figure out over the board if you pretend to be like a reasonably strong player. So I was very unhappy, not really with the result. You know, it happens, I guess. I mean, you're never thrilled when you draw with white against anybody, but especially playing down. But it can happen. Just the way it happened was very, very concerning, and again, kind of boded poorly for the rest of the tournament, because we're kind of already, like, I was already doubting my tactical ability and my calculation. Now I'm also kind of doubting my positional understanding in, you know, openings that aren't my main thing, but the types of positions that very much are my main weapon these days. So really a very, very rough start to the tournament, especially after the last two have gone so poorly. But at the same time, just the start of the tournament, you know, it's fine to start slow in a tournament as long as you perform once you start getting to the real games against the stronger players. And so I figured, okay, if we stumble once along the way, it's fine. We just used up our margin for error. So we're gonna hope to correct. If we can win one more game, then it's kind of all moot. We've at least equalized the tournament a little bit. And so I wanted to focus. I wanted to just kind of forget this game as quickly as possible and move on to round 3. So I'm going to do the same thing now, try to forget about this game as quickly as possible, and I will see you all for round 3. Thank you for watching.